Welcome to the Deep Dive, the place where we turn massive amounts of sources and complex histories into actionable knowledge, tailor-made for you. Today, we are taking on an idea that many of us treat as maybe the highest virtue in a modern democracy. We're talking about free speech.
It's an idea that's, almost universally held up as an absolute good. We're raised on this assumption that the more freedom of expression we have, the better society is.
Right, that's the default setting.
It is. The default is that speech is benign, that it's just ideas floating around, and if you just let everyone talk, truth will sort of automatically win out.
Okay, so that's the assumption we're all operating under. Let's unpack that entire structure, because when you look at the historical sources you've shared with us, the journey of this concept suggests it's anything but simple.
It's not simple at all.
For most of human history, it seems the freedom to speak your mind has been a highly volatile, constantly changing, and often genuinely dangerous idea.
Exactly, and that's our mission in this deep dive. We want to fundamentally challenge those contemporary presumptions, especially that free speech means absolute unrestrained expression.
So we're going to trace its history.
We are, all the way from ancient fears about the sheer, almost physical power of words, through bloody religious wars, colonial oppression, right up to the dilemmas we're facing in the modern digital marketplace.
The idea here is to equip you, the listener, with the historical context you need, so you can understand how to think about free speech, not just in your own country, whether that's the unique American First Amendment culture or the balancing act of European democracy, but as a global issue.
A global issue of power, of constraint, and really of political survival.
And that global context feels incredibly relevant right now.
Oh, absolutely. You just have to look at how different countries approach this.
Yeah.
The zealous, almost religious defense of free speech you see in the U.S., for instance, is profoundly different from how the concept is managed in Britain or across the EU, or especially in a place like China.
That clash between the ideal and the reality of state authority is so immediate. We can even see it in that modern anecdote you brought in.
Yes, the publisher in 2015.
Right. A publisher was going a philosophy book translated for release in mainland China. And they had a contract that explicitly said no editorial changes. But the editor just went in and censored huge passages anyway.
Unilaterally.
Huh.
Just deleted or rewrote entire sections they decided were politically sensitive. And when the author pushed back, pointing to the contract and just basic intellectual integrity,
What happened?
the editor just said, well, we're referring this to the officials at the Press and Publication Bureau in Nanjing. And that was it. The government censors had the final say.
So the message was crystal clear.
Completely. Ideology and state control trump everything. Commercial contracts, intellectual property, none of it matters. There's no debate.
And that reality, that constant monitoring, the ideological mission of the state, it flies in the face of all that early optimism about technology, doesn't it? The internet was supposed to be this great liberator.
It was supposed to shatter authoritarian structures. But what we're seeing is that authoritarian states, and the Chinese Communist Party in particular, are arguably winning the information war. They're combining every old tool of control, like those editorial boards and press bureaus, with incredibly sophisticated new digital ones.
The great firewall, automated keyword blocking.
Exactly. So this shows us that the history of speech regulation isn't some dusty academic subject. It's alive, and it is actively shaping global power dynamics right now.
So if we really want to understand our modern predicament, we have to start where that assumption of absolute freedom just didn't exist at all.
We have to go back to the pre-modern world.
And figure out why people were so afraid of words in the first place.
That's the key. Historically, the idea of free speech as some kind of inherent individual right was not just non-existent, it was practically unintelligible. Pre-modern societies didn't grant rights to individuals in that way.
They operated on duties and hierarchies.
Yes. And within that framework, they overwhelmingly stress the inherent dangers of outspokenness.
And this wasn't just, some philosophical, be careful what you wish for kind of thing. This was practical. They saw words as potent, almost physical actions.
Not just harmless chatter.
No, not at all.
They absolutely saw words as physical forces, capable of inflicting real-world harm. I mean, think about some of the examples we have from ancient wisdom. There's that powerful Assyrian proverb.
The word is a bird. Once released, no man can recapture it.
Exactly, that sense of irreversibility. It immediately tells you there's profound risk involved. Once it's out there, you can't take it back. Its consequences just fly free.
And that idea that words are foundational actions, it was embedded in law and culture everywhere in totally different societies.
It was. Take the earliest Indian law code. It cautioned that all things are founded on speech. And they took that to a really extreme conclusion.
The idea that stealing speech is the worst crime.
Right. They literally stated, a man who steals speech is guilty of stealing everything. Just think about that for a second. The hierarchy of crime. Stealing cattle, stealing property, that's bad. But stealing the means of utterance, the very thing that holds society together,
That was the ultimate theft.
it's the most profound theft of all. Because speech wasn't just opinion, it was property, it was power, it was the very architecture of their civilization.
And it was often seen as having the same or even greater impact than physical violence.
Yeah.
You shared an instruction to an Egyptian ruler from, what, 2 millennia before Christ?
Yes, advising him to be a craftsman in speech, for the tongue is a sword to a man, and speech is more valorous than any fighting.
The tongue is a sword.
If speech is literally more valorous than combat, more potent than a physical weapon, then you can bet the authorities are going to be intensely focused on controlling it. I mean, throughout ancient civilization, words were critical for everything. Spells, curses, oaths, blessings.
So bad words didn't just cause offense.
No, they broke sacred vows, they started political feuds, they ruined reputations, and they caused massive social, and they believed, divine disorder.
So this pre-modern truth, which was shared globally, that speech is an action with real, measurable consequences. That's the fundamental fact that our modern absolute free speech ideology tends to forget, or maybe actively dismiss.
And that need to police expression, it moves from just general social harmony to a really specific, urgent political necessity in the 16th and 17th centuries.
After the Protestant Reformation.
Exactly. The Reformation fractures Christendom,
Yeah.
and this creates a new, intense focus on discovering and suppressing heterodoxy.
Let's pause on that word, heterodoxy, because it's so important here. This isn't just about having different ideas.
No, it's much more dangerous than that. It's speech or thought that deviates from the officially sanctioned capital T truth, the one true path to salvation.
And every warring sect believed they had it.
They all did. Catholics, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Puritans, they all presumed they possessed the singular God-given truth. And they felt this moral and spiritual duty to stamp out any deviant idea. If they didn't, their entire society could face eternal damnation.
So the stakes were terrifyingly high.
And deeply personal, this led to intense, pervasive monitoring of what people said and even what they thought.
And the things that could get you in trouble were, astonishingly minor by our standards. It just shows you how precarious it was to say anything.
Take the case of Alexander Champion of Wiltshire in 1612.
Okay.
He's just a common man. He gets a little tipsy in a tavern, and he starts speculating, maybe trying to sound clever, and he says something like, heaven and hell are like his table and his bench, so you could step from one to another.
It's just a bit of drunken philosophizing.
That's all it was. But that single slip a moment of theological speculation that contradicted the official doctrine about the eternal separation of the saved and the damned, it landed him immediately in a local church court for blasphemy.
Wow. Not some grand revolutionary speech, just tavern chatter.
But it was actionable. And it was terrifying. And if you kept at it, if you persisted in something that was deemed serious heterodoxy, the consequences were fatal. We're talking about thousands of men and women being burned at the stake across Europe during this period.
Just for their words or their beliefs.
And the secular governments were just as intrusive. As monarchs centralized their power, they wanted closer control over what their subjects were thinking and saying. They knew political instability often started with rumors and criticism.
And this is where they invent that famously vague crime, sedition.
Yes, and we shouldn't just gloss over that term. Sedition, in this context, it wasn't high treason. It wasn't about plotting to kill the king.
It was about speech, disloyal speech.
Fundamentally. And what made it such an effective tool of control was its vagueness. The core idea was that verbal disaffection could spread like a disease, and it had to be cut out before it became a full-blown rebellion.
So the crime was often just in the intent, as judged by the Crown.
Entirely. It didn't matter if your criticism was factually true. If the court decided your words were intended to sow discord or mistrust of the government, that was the crime.
And the enforcement was brutal.
Absolutely brutal. During Henry VIII's reign alone, more than 100 people were executed in just 6 years for supposedly treasonous or seditious words. The punishments were these terrifying public spectacles designed to scare everyone else into silence.
Which brings us to the lawyer, John Stubbs.
John Stubbs, a Puritan lawyer in 1579, he writes a pamphlet criticizing Queen Elizabeth I's potential marriage negotiations. He just argued it was a bad political match for England.
A political opinion piece, basically.
And for that, he, along with his printer and his publisher, received a horrifyingly specific sentence. They were to have their right hands chopped off in public.
Can you even imagine that? The theatrical cruelty of it? Literally losing your writing hand because you published an opinion piece criticizing the Queen's choice of spouse? It really puts modern political outrage into grim perspective.
It does, and the principle was the same across all European governments. Disloyal speech must be punished, immediately and severely, to maintain order.
So we've established that control was at the core of pre-modern regulation. But the sources show it wasn't just about protecting the powerful from their subjects, it was also about something else.
Yes, it was also a desperate attempt to uphold a kind of civic truth, to fight back against what one observer called that great and immoderate liberty of lying.
This is a huge historical lesson, and it connects directly to our own digital chaos.
It really does. Because the texts that the authorities were most focused on suppressing were not, well-reasoned arguments from philosophers. They weren't debating political theory.
What were they then?
They were the texts that trafficked in scurrilous slanders and outrageous conspiracy theories.
Okay, that completely shifts the focus. So they weren't primarily afraid of intellectual dissent. They were afraid of political chaos being fueled by what we would now call, I guess, viral rumors and hate speech.
Precisely. The texts deemed truly dangerous were the underground pamphlets that portrayed Queen Elizabeth as a lustful whore, or claimed leading churchmen were secret sodomites, or whipped up these endless paranoid panics about covert Jesuit plots.
These weren't intellectual debates aimed at reform.
No, they were malicious propaganda designed to destabilize the entire society.
And these wild rumors, these slanders, they had enormous immediate consequences. They led directly to riots and mass social disorder.
They did. We have that striking example from 1625, right when Charles I took the throne. A completely baseless political rumor starts spreading across England.
The rumor that papists, meaning Catholics, were going to rise up and kill Protestants in their sleep.
Totally false. But it spread with astonishing speed. Within a single week, that news had traveled all the way to Cornwall. It created widespread panicked alarm, fear of invasion, fear of rebellion all along the southwest coast.
It shows the sheer power of uncontrolled misinformation, even in a world without the internet. Communication was already getting faster than the official counter-narrative could move.
And these individual instances of chaos, they started to accumulate. You had baseless stories like the malicious rumor that the Duke of Buckingham had murdered the old king, James I.
Which paved the way for real violence.
Directly. It led to the murder of the Duke's accomplice and then Buckingham's own assassination in 1628. A lie, widely distributed, directly changed the course of politics and deepened the mistrust of the monarchy.
And what's so tragic historically is that the growing influence of all these competing conspiracy theories, this toxic, uncontrolled stew of propaganda and lies, is exactly what caused the final political breakdown in the 1640s.
It led directly to a decade of devastating civil wars across the British Isles.
The irony is just profound. This was the exact disaster, social disorder, war, killing the king, that the original ideology of speech regulation had always been designed to prevent.
The failure to successfully police that communicative space arguably created the very catastrophe the regulators feared most.
So, out of that cataclysmic chaos and bloodshed, that century of religious strife and civil war, new practices, and eventually new ideas slowly started to emerge.
But not always intentionally.
Right, often accidentally.
Yes, driven more by exhaustion than by some enlightened new policy. The first tentative steps were towards religious toleration, mainly among Protestant thinkers. They just realized that this continuous, bloody conflict over theological details was politically and spiritually unsustainable.
So people started arguing that they should just leave each other in peace, since only God could truly judge who was right and who was wrong.
Exactly. Reformers began to argue against using the sword to silence what they believed was God's holy truth. And that's where we get that powerful humanistic line from Sebastian Castellio.
To kill a man is not to defend a doctrine, but to kill a man.
A profound shift. The proper response to heterodoxy was now being framed as persuasion and reasoned debate, not execution. But the crucial transition to political freedom in England was largely unintentional, almost a bureaucratic screw-up.
This is where we get to the Licensing Act.
The Licensing Act. This was the law that required all publications to be pre-approved by the government, a system of prior restraint. And in 1695, this whole system just
It
lapsed.
just stopped. Why?
It lapsed because members of parliament who were already exhausted by constant political squabbles couldn't agree on a workable way to control religious discussion in this new, slightly more tolerant environment. So they just failed to renew the act.
So it wasn't a great philosophical victory for free speech.
Not at all. It was legislative incompetence.
And the result of this failure was immediate and dramatic.
An unprecedented explosion of newsprint. Suddenly, England had the most unrestrained, fast-paced political discourse in the world. And liberty of the press became a popular, fashionable phrase, even if it was still really vaguely defined.
And that was the problem for decades, right?
Yeah.
There was no real legal or philosophical doctrine to defend this new freewheeling press.
None. People made this vague distinction between beneficial liberty of the press, which meant open discussion of public affairs, and punishable license, which meant slander or lies. But that distinction was completely subjective.
It was based on who the government was angry at that week.
Pretty much. There was no theoretical framework to protect a truly free press from a prosecutor who just decided, you know what, this is too licentious.
That intellectual vacuum was then dramatically and permanently filled between 1720 and 1723.
By two ambitious London journalists, Thomas Gordon and John Trenchard.
And their anonymous newspaper articles that became known as Cato's Letters.
A collection of essays that became foundational to modern Western liberalism. They were one of the most widely read and influential Anglo-American works of the 18th century. They profoundly shaped the intellectual climate of the American Revolution.
What's so key here is the profound shift they engineered. I mean, their political theory borrowed from earlier Enlightenment writers, but their arguments about speech were totally new.
They were. No one before Cato had established an essentially secular, popular political right to free speech. They didn't see it as a privilege granted by the powerful. They saw it as an inherent right necessary to restrain the powerful.
They called it the great bulwark of liberty.
And the framing was ingenious. It shifted the conversation away from theology and into practical government. They conceived of free speech primarily as an antidote to governmental oppression.
Their argument was that only the corrupt and the guilty fear free speech.
Because its true purpose is to restrain the powerful from doing wrong. Honest leaders, they argued, should welcome public scrutiny.
And this is where the real friction comes in, where they deliberately provoke the traditional views and really set the stage for modern libertarian thought. They go right after libel.
The elephant in the room. Libel had always been seen as a serious evil, something that poisoned political discourse. But Cato's bottom line was a radical defense of pretty much untrammeled expression.
They framed even malicious slander, purposefully publishing lies, as an evil arising out of a much greater good.
Their calculation was that the risk of true political inquiry being silenced by a libel charge was far more dangerous than the risk of some innocent person being slandered.
So they took the radical stance. Rather, many libels should escape, then the liberty of the press should be infringed.
Which was based on this hugely optimistic premise that the judgment of the people does rarely err. In Cato's world, the abstract principle of expression always trumped the rights of individuals against being falsely accused. They just presumed that free speech always empowered the weak and that only guilty men feared libels.
What makes this history so deeply ironic, then, is that the intellectual champion of this novel, supposedly incorruptible secular ideal, was himself profoundly corruptible.
Thomas Gordon, one of the two authors.
Wait, so the man who codifies the absolute right to free speech as the bulwark of liberty was a mercenary writer. That level of hypocrisy is almost unbelievable.
It is. But he practically admitted to it in the letters themselves. He wrote that common hackney writers write only for money and can change their tune at the drop of a hat. And Gordon was the prime example. He was writing these soaring defenses of liberty while facing immense pressure from the government.
And rather than stand firm on principle,
He sold out completely. Even as the government was piling pressure on the London Journal in 1721, with a warrant rumored for his arrest, he was secretly having clandestine meetings with government ministers.
and they made him an offer.
Many offers, as he put it. A secret pension, outright cash, in return for abandoning Cato's letters and switching his allegiance to the ministry.
And he took it.
He did. He became Prime Minister Robert Walpole's most trusted secret censor for nearly 2 decades. He grew rich and powerful in the pay of the very government his philosophy was supposed to restrain. It illustrates a profound, early point about the ideals of press liberty. They were always politically expedient for their loudest proponents. The moment the heat was on or the money was right, the champion of the bulwark of liberty became its chief agent of control.
It really underlines the point made by Matthew Kindle, a contemporary thinker, who cautioned that a free press was the support of all our liberties. But if you abuse it, it could become an engine to destroy them all.
And the fact that Cato's letters itself, the foundational text, was dismissed by many at the time as highly criminal and libels pernicious to the state just highlights that inherent contradiction. The idea was born in high rhetoric and immediate betrayal.
And that contradiction only gets deeper when we look at who this new freedom was actually for. The ideal articulated in Cato's letters was never equally distributed.
No, it was fundamentally a theory designed for and benefiting a very specific segment of society.
The sources show that Cato's letters was a fundamentally male text, written by men, for men, and basically ignoring the central role women played in the public sphere.
And women were absolutely vital. They were printers, booksellers, and often the primary audience for news and political discussion in the home. Yet the political theory that emerged from this period helped solidify this self-serving fiction that formal politics and public discourse were exclusively a masculine domain.
A fiction that ran completely contrary to reality. I mean, we have that striking example of Margaret Brent in the American colonies.
A rich, well-connected Maryland settler. In 1648, right in the middle of Civil War chaos, she addresses the colony's assembly, and she demands vote in the House for herself and voice also.
So not just the right to speak, but the right to representation.
Both. And
Uh,
when she was denied, she protested all their proceedings. She basically shut down the assembly's legitimacy by pointing out the hypocrisy of their liberty. The idea that women were just absent from the public sphere was always a convenient political lie.
and this exclusion was also deeply racialized, especially in the American context.
Oh, absolutely. The text of Cato's letters is full of condemnations of enslavement in principle, yet the American champions who popularized it were personally connected to and enriched by the institution of slavery.
So this new concept of free speech was inextricably shadowed by the reality of racialized unfreedom.
Early American newspapers, which we now celebrate as the shining examples of early press liberty, were simultaneously powerful tools of white supremacy.
How so?
Well, they facilitated the slave trade, they published constant advertisements reinforcing ideas of non-white inferiority, and they regularly ran notices for escaped slaves. One of whom, ironically, was a Negro man named Cato, sharing the very name of the champion of liberty.
The paradox is just stark. The freedom to publish was literally built on the foundation of human bondage.
And the most famous early American defense of press liberty, the 1735 Zenger trial, is the ultimate illustration of this. Zenger's champions, people like James Alexander and Lewis Morris Sr., were large slaveholders.
And they saw no contradiction.
None at all. They saw the freedom of political expression for white men as perfectly compatible with keeping others in bondage. In fact, they reinforced each other. Liberty was, fundamentally, a mark of racial hegemony.
And these racial and imperial assumptions, they didn't just stop in the colonial era. They were integrated right into the work of the 19th century's most influential liberal theorist, John Stuart Mill.
Yes, his book on liberty is foundational to modern Western defenses of expression.
And this is where we uncover what's now known as the Millian flaw.
The hypocrisy at the heart of classical liberalism. Mill is held up as this great progressive philosopher, but he was a dedicated, lifelong agent of the East India Company. He worked at the very highest levels of British administration over India.
So his theory of liberty, which we often read as this universal beautiful thing, was actually profoundly imperialist and conditional.
He used a single hierarchical index of civilization to judge all the world's peoples. And he inherited and codified the view that non-European societies were still in their infancy. He called their inhabitants irrational, mentally undeveloped, and explicitly not capable of administering its own affairs.
This philosophical ranking system allowed him to be a liberal at home and justify despotism abroad.
Pretty much. So despite his celebrated defense of individual freedom, Mill explicitly stated that his theory of personal liberty, freedom of speech, thought, and association could not apply to these immature, non-European human beings.
He called them unfledged children.
And he maintained that their only chance of progress lay in being despotically ruled by Europeans. This was the crucial asterisk on liberty. It was reserved only for human beings in the maturity of their faculties, a category he defined exclusively by his own culture.
And British officials on the ground in India, the ones actually running the empire, were even more blunt about the connection between free speech and colonial collapse.
Oh, much more blunt. Officials like Sir Thomas Munro argued openly that granting press freedom to the natives would generate insubordination, insurrection, and anarchy.
Their logic being.
The official view was that the first logical duty of a truly free press in India would be to deliver the country from a foreign yoke. Therefore, exercising the most absolute control over the native press wasn't tyranny. It was the natural course of action to perpetuate British rule.
They were afraid that if natives could print freely, they'd publicize all the ways Europeans were exploiting the country and inspire people to overthrow the government.
Which was probably true.
Okay.
But colonized populations were not silent. Indian nationalists like Raja Rammohun Roy skillfully challenged this hypocrisy. They didn't just passively accept Mill's racist categorization.
What did they do?
They asserted that they deserved the same civil and religious privileges that every Briton is entitled to in England.
So they used the rhetoric of liberty against the colonizer?
Exactly. By demanding the full rights of British citizenship, they forced British officials into a corner, making it legally and philosophically difficult to differentiate between the native press and European print. They showed that the fight for freedom of expression was intrinsically linked to the fight for self-determination.
And these lofty, if hypocritical, ideals of Mill and Gordon were already colliding with an even bigger, uglier force by the 19th century: commercialization.
The rise of mass-market, highly capitalized media. This created a marketplace of ideas that was dictated not by philosophical debate, but by financial power.
This is where money starts to shout over reasoned debate.
The economic scale required to even participate in public discourse just exploded. By 1845, if you wanted to launch a major London paper like the Daily News, it could cost an enormous sum, £100,000, which is tens of millions in today's money.
Which means the only people who get to influence public opinion are those who are already massively wealthy.
Or who are backed by massive wealth. As the radical journalist William Cobbett observed, the rich people rule the press, which makes it an enemy of true freedom for the poor. They had no way to appeal to the public against the powerful establishment.
So this new marketplace was neither transparent nor equally accessible.
Not at all. And Karl Marx, observing this emerging system, developed a powerful critique that still resonates today. He saw freedom of the press under capitalism not as an individual right, but as freedom to buy up newspapers and fake public opinion for the benefit of the bourgeoisie.
Marx argued that a newspaper in France, for instance, might not be subject to intellectual censorship. The government wasn't officially crossing out words.
But it was subject to a profound material censorship.
And that material censorship was what?
The requirement for an exorbitant high-security deposit just to get a license to exist. That requirement effectively pulled the press out of its true sphere of public discourse and into the sphere of big business speculations.
So Marx saw money itself as the most effective form of censorship in a capitalist society.
He did. The sheer capital requirement was the real censorship. And the pursuit of profit, even back then, was clearly incompatible with the pursuit of truth. Knowledgeable observers noted that the media landscape was largely determined by commercial pressures. Newspapers would only address the public interest if it didn't hinder their publishers' profit motives.
And that critical perspective would later fuel radical non-Western alternatives to the liberal model.
The most dramatic and perhaps most successful of those alternatives emerged after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917.
Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks.
They immediately seized control of all printing presses and declared press freedom anti-proletarian. And this wasn't just censorship, it was a completely different philosophical starting point for information control.
Lenin argued that restoring press freedom would just mean giving all the printing presses and newsprint back to the capitalists, whom he called poisoners of the people.
And that would make the press a powerful, centralized weapon of the world bourgeoisie used to crush the workers' revolution. His view was brutally explicit.
He said the freedom of the press slogan was only relevant up to the 19th century when newspapers were smaller operations.
But in the modern capitalized era, he said, freedom of the press means freedom to buy up newspapers, to buy writers, to bribe, buy, and fake public opinion for the benefit of the bourgeoisie.
So his solution was to abolish private ownership entirely.
And make the press a collective, centralized tool of the state, serving the political goals of the proletariat. And this profound distrust of the profit motive and the bourgeoisie press It persists today in systems like the Chinese Communist Party.
You can see that distrust written right into their fundamental law. While the CCP Constitution guarantees free speech in Article 35, Article 51 severely limits it.
It states explicitly that the exercise of freedoms may not infringe upon the interests of the state. And the state, as interpreted by the party, is the sole judge of what constitutes the people's interest.
This philosophy maintains that the Marxist view of news fundamentally rejects the Western concept of press freedom.
Which leads directly to the massive, sophisticated digital censorship we see today, blocking thousands of sensitive keywords and phrases like Tiananmen Square 1989 or references to the Dalai Lama.
It reflects a deep, almost paranoid mistrust of popular judgment.
A mistrust rooted in Lenin's fear that the capitalist press is constantly lurking nearby and watching, waiting for a chance to pounce and crush the socialist system. It shows that in systems that prioritize collective order over individual rights, media control remains absolute and technologically advanced.
So if we move back to the West, we see this fascinating divergence, particularly in the United States, where modern First Amendment law has become a global exception. It largely rejects considerations of truth, harm, or context that we see elsewhere.
And this exceptionalism is surprisingly recent. If you look at American law before the 1960s, rulings on things like defamation, obscenity, and even hate speech were much closer to the regulatory models in other Western nations.
The fundamental change began with landmark Supreme Court cases in the 1960s, initially aimed at protecting civil rights advocates from libel suits filed by Southern officials.
But the doctrine that resulted from that had world-changing implications. In 1964, the Supreme Court set the almost impossible standard of actual malice for public officials to win defamation claims.
Let's make that practical. What does actual malice actually force a plaintiff to prove? It sounds like an impossible burden.
It essentially is. You don't just have to prove the statement was false, which is hard enough.
Yeah.
You have to prove the publisher released it either with knowledge that it was false or with reckless disregard of whether it was false or not.
Proving what was in the mind of the publisher.
Which is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
It almost entirely protects even abusive and false speech.
In the court's justification.
The justification was that this was necessary to ensure public debate remained uninhibited, robust, and wide open. The clear implication was that abuse, falsehood, and defamation were just the price of doing business in public life. The cause of truth and the real injury to people wronged by lies were deemed irrelevant if they risked dampening the vigor of political debate.
And at the same time, the courts were increasingly enshrining the connection between political speech and spending money.
Yes, beginning in the 1970s and solidified in the 2010s, a series of rulings struck down regulations designed to equalize influence in political campaigns. The court ruled that the idea of regulating political spending to level the playing field was wholly foreign to the First Amendment.
So in modern American doctrine, political speech and spending money are now basically the same thing.
More money, more voice. It's the ultimate capitalist marketplace of ideas.
And then came the internet problem, codified in Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act, just 26 words that fundamentally reshaped global communication.
Those words granted internet companies legal immunity from liability for user content, so they couldn't be sued for things users posted, while simultaneously giving them an absolute right to censor content as private actors.
Which created the system we have now.
A system where these platforms, with their unprecedented global reach and financial power, think Google, Meta, prioritize engagement and profit over advancing truth or democracy. Their business model relies on keeping users hooked and monetizing personal data, which often means promoting the most polarizing and inflammatory content.
It's a modern digital manifestation of Marx's material censorship, but amplified exponentially by algorithms designed for profit, not public good.
So if the American approach is championing absolute individual expression and equating money with speech, what's the global alternative, the one operating on a fundamentally different starting line?
Well, the majority of the world, in Europe in particular, operates on what's called a balancing model.
Right. And this approach is rooted in the 1950 European Convention on Human Rights, or ECHR. It requires balancing the right to free expression against competing values, often just called the public interest.
This means they accept that freedoms, including speech, are not absolute. They have to be weighed against other core values like national security, public safety, health, morals, and the rights and reputations of others.
Which allows for guardrails against harm. Things like laws against group libel or hate speech, which are seen as necessary to protect the fabric of democratic citizenship.
And we see this balance articulated today in concrete, actionable laws like the European Union's Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act.
These aren't just vague philosophical ideas. They're mandates that force digital power to align with the public good.
What does that mandate look like in practice?
Well, the DSA, for example, requires major platforms to conduct risk assessments about the systemic threats their services pose, specifically around the spread of illegal content and misinformation. It forces companies to be transparent about their algorithms, to quickly remove illegal content, and crucially, it bans targeted advertising based on sensitive data like your political views or religion.
So the core principle here is just fundamentally different from the American one.
Completely. It recognizes that speech is an action that can cause harm, individually or cumulatively, and that the shapers of public discourse should be held accountable in proportion to their economic and communicative power. The European model presumes that the marketplace of ideas must serve the public good, even if that means placing constraints on how platforms make their money.
So after all this, what does it all mean? We've traced this history from a world where words were seen as lethal actions subject to strict control to a world where they're marketed and algorithmically amplified commodities, subject mainly to capital.
The central tension is unavoidable, and it defines the debate today. The history of free speech is a struggle between those who assume an absolute, individual, content-neutral right and who mistrust state censorship above all else, and those who recognize that speech is an action.
And that freedom, for some, often requires meaningful constraints on others.
That classic individualistic paradigm of free speech, the idea that abstract notions rationally compete in a neutral marketplace and truth will just naturally emerge, is entirely at odds with the reality we have documented across centuries.
The history is clear. Who speaks, who gets heard, and who makes the rules has always been fundamentally more about power, wealth, and systemic bias than about rational debate.
And the failure to regulate the communicative marketplace is just utterly irrational when you look at every other market in society. We demand that society regulates food, medicine, financial services.
To protect users from cheats and liars, and to benefit the common good.
So, to refuse to apply guardrails to the most powerful engines of public discourse, the technology that shapes reality for billions, is simply illogical. It's a failure of governance.
And this problem is only getting exponentially more acute. The mass public release of artificial intelligence tools, particularly those driven by companies seeking profit and market dominance, is making the challenge of large-scale, individualized misinformation faster and more convincing than ever before.
So considering that some societies are attempting to address these threats through new legal guardrails and mandated accountability, while others cling to purely libertarian principles of more speech as the only solution, we have to ask ourselves a really tough question.
What new guardrails must you demand to ensure the communicative marketplace serves the public good in the age of generative AI, where the speed and credibility of malicious content is almost instantaneous?
That's something profound to reflect on as you navigate the rising noise and manufactured reality of the digital world.
Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.